Before civilization, there was no progress. There was only survival. For most of the time humans have existed, the world did not improve. It repeated itself. Seasons changed, animals migrated, children were born, and people died. Knowledge accumulated slowly, if at all. Each generation learned just enough to endure what the previous one had endured. Life was fragile, and it was short. This is important to understand because modern minds often imagine early humans as curious explorers, slowly advancing towards civilization as if it were an obvious destination. It wasn't. Civilization was not a goal, it was a response. And like most responses forged under pressure, it carried consequences that were invisible at first. The earliest humans did not seek meaning, they sought continuation. They lived in a world that did not care whether they survived. Predators were stronger, weather was indifferent, disease had no intention, hunger arrived without warning. There was no justice in nature, only outcomes. And so the first human problem was not philosophical, it was biological. How do we stay alive? Early hominins answered this question in many ways. Most answers failed. Species appeared, adapted briefly, and vanished. Extinction was not exceptional, it was the default. What distinguished the line that led to us was not strength, speed, or even intelligence in the modern sense. It was flexibility, the ability to cooperate in ways that went beyond instinct. Other animals cooperate, but only within narrow limits. Humans learn to cooperate across time. They shared food, they protected the injured, they taught skills, and most importantly, they remembered together. Memory became collective. This is where something subtle but profound began to change. Survival was no longer only an individual effort, it became a shared project. Fire was one of the earliest turning points. It offered warmth, protection, and cooked food. But fire also changed time. Nights became usable. Darkness no longer meant inactivity. People gathered, they talked, they gestured, they told stories. Those stories mattered, not because they were accurate, but because they were shared. A story does something unique. It allows a group of individuals to hold the same idea at the same time. It synchronizes perception. It creates a shared reality. At first, these stories were practical: where the animals move, which plants kill, when the rains come. Over time, they became symbolic: why we hunt, who we are, what happens after death. This was not superstition replacing reason, it was cooperation scaling beyond what direct experience could support. A group bound by shared belief could act together even when individuals doubted. That coordination was powerful, and power, once discovered, rarely disappears. As human groups grew larger, cooperation became harder. Trust does not scale naturally. You can know 30 people. You cannot know 300. You certainly cannot know 3,000. Something had to bridge the gap. That bridge was belief. Belief does not require verification. It requires acceptance. And acceptance can be taught, repeated, enforced, and inherited. This was the invisible infrastructure of early human societies. Before laws, before rulers, before written language, belief made large groups possible. But belief alone was not enough to transform the human condition. For tens of thousands of years, people lived this way: mobile, cooperative, vulnerable. Then, slowly, something shifted. The climate stabilized. Certain regions became more predictable. Wild grains grew in dense patches. Animals followed reliable routes. For the first time, staying in one place became possible. This was not an invention, it was an adaptation. Agriculture did not appear because humans desired progress. It appeared because it reduced uncertainty in the short term. Planting seeds meant work now in exchange for food later. That trade felt reasonable. The costs were hidden. Settling down allowed food storage. Storage allowed population growth. Population growth created pressure. Pressure demanded organization. Fields had boundaries. Storage had owners. Defense required hierarchy. This is where civilization begins to take shape, not as an idea, but as a structure. Agriculture did not make life easier. In many ways, it made it worse. Diets narrowed, disease spread, physical labor increased. Early farmers were shorter, weaker, and less healthy than their foraging ancestors. But agriculture made societies denser, and density changes everything. When people cannot leave easily, systems replace choice. A nomad who disagrees can walk away. A farmer cannot abandon a field. Land ties people to place. Place ties people to power. Surplus appeared. Not everyone needed to farm. Some managed storage. Some organized labor. Some specialized in tools. Some specialized in ritual. Specialization increased efficiency. It also increased inequality. Those closest to surplus gained leverage. Those controlling distribution gained authority. Authority hardened into hierarchy. This was not tyranny imposed from above, it was structure emerging from necessity. Once food could be stored, it could be withheld. Once labor could be organized, it could be commanded. Once belief justified order, disobedience became deviance. The first villages became towns. Towns became cities. Cities required coordination at scale. At this point, belief evolved again. Stories were no longer only about survival, they became about legitimacy. Why this family rules, why this place is sacred, why obedience is moral. Gods emerged not as explanations of nature, but as guarantors of order. A god does not merely describe reality, a god authorizes behavior. If the gods demand hierarchy, hierarchy becomes righteous. If the gods favor kings, kings are inevitable. This was an extraordinary solution to a difficult problem. How do you convince thousands of unrelated people to obey rules that limit them? You make those rules feel eternal. Early civilizations were not naive, they were pragmatic. They understood that force alone could not maintain order indefinitely. Soldiers tire, violence breeds resentment. Belief lasts longer. Once belief is embedded, it becomes culture. Once culture becomes tradition, questioning feels dangerous. This is how power stabilizes. Cities like Uruk, and later Memphis did not arise because humans became wiser. They arose because humans became interdependent. Interdependence requires coordination. Coordination requires authority. Writing emerged not to preserve poetry, but to track grain. Bureaucracy preceded literature. Accounting preceded philosophy. The first written records are inventories, contracts, and debts. Civilization did not begin with ideals, it began with administration. And administration reshapes morality.
When systems manage resources, individuals become categories: workers, soldiers, priests, slaves. Identity becomes functional. This abstraction made large societies possible. It also made them impersonal. From this point forward, history accelerates. Cities compete, armies form, trade expands, power concentrates. Civilization solves one problem and creates several more. Hunger decreases for some, Inequality increases for many. Order replaces chaos. Freedom narrows. None of this was planned. It was cumulative. This is the pattern that repeats throughout history. Each solution contains the seed of the next crisis. By the end of this first phase, humanity had crossed a threshold it could not return from. There were now systems larger than individuals. And once systems exist, they demand maintenance. They demand obedience. They demand belief. And they demand justification. That demand will shape everything that follows. Once cities existed, humanity faced a problem it had never encountered before. How do you govern strangers? In small groups, authority is personal. You know who leads. You know why. Leadership is situational, strong in crisis, flexible in peace. But cities do not function on familiarity. They function on repetition. Rules must apply even when no one is watching. This is where power changes its nature. Early cities were crowded, unequal, and tense. Resources flowed into storage facilities controlled by a few. Labor was organized on a scale no individual could refuse without consequence. Conflict was no longer episodic, it was structural. Someone had to decide. At first, authority was administrative: managers of grain, coordinators of irrigation, overseers of labor. But administration quickly becomes judgment. Judgment becomes command. Command seeks permanence. This is the birth of kingship. The earliest kings were not divine, they were necessary. Cities required coordination during floods, droughts, and war. A central figure simplified decision-making. Unity under pressure feels efficient. But efficiency invites consolidation. Once a king exists, succession becomes a problem. If authority is personal, it dies with the person. That instability is dangerous for systems that depend on continuity. The solution was symbolic transformation. The king became more than a man. He became an office, then a lineage, then a sacred role. Power was no longer temporary. It was inherited. This required justification. In Mesopotamia, the earliest civilizations experimented openly with hierarchy. They did not pretend equality existed. Instead, they formalized difference. Law emerged as the great stabilizer. The law did not promise fairness, it promised predictability. The Code of Hammurabi is often remembered as a moral achievement. It was not. It was a political one. It defined status. It assigned consequences based on class. It taught people where they stood. Justice became structured. If you knew your place, you knew what to expect. This reduced conflict, not because it was just, but because it was clear. Clarity is calming in unstable systems. But law alone cannot sustain obedience. Law requires enforcement. Enforcement requires belief that punishment is legitimate. This is where gods enter fully into governance. In Egypt, this integration reached its most complete form. The pharaoh was not merely chosen by the gods, he was divine. Obedience to him was obedience to the universe itself. This alignment of power and cosmos was profound. If reality itself endorses authority, resistance becomes unthinkable. Death, which terrified humans everywhere, was repurposed. Life was temporary. Order was eternal. Obedience guaranteed continuity beyond death. The afterlife became political. This was not manipulation in the modern sense, it was coherence. A society aligned its metaphysics with its administration. The result was remarkable stability and remarkable rigidity. Elsewhere, different solutions emerged. In the Indus Valley, authority appears quieter. Cities were planned, infrastructure was standardized, but monumental kingship is absent. Power existed, but it was embedded in systems rather than persons. This shows something important. Power does not require spectacle. It requires compliance. In China, authority evolved again. Here, kingship was justified not by divinity, but by performance. The mandate of heaven granted legitimacy, but it could be withdrawn. Disaster was interpreted as failure. Rebellion became morally permissible. This was a conditional authority, powerful but not absolute. It restrained tyranny. It also normalized cycles of collapse. Across these civilizations, one pattern repeats. As societies grow, authority must be justified. Justification must feel natural. Naturalization requires belief. Belief stabilizes obedience. But obedience reshapes human psychology. People adapt to hierarchy. They internalize rules. They learn to self-regulate. Civilization does not only control behavior, it trains minds. This is why power persists even when rulers change. Once obedience becomes a habit, systems endure. Over time, power hardens. Elites emerge. Roles fossilize. Mobility narrows. Civilization works, but at a cost. Security increases. Freedom decreases. Productivity rises. Autonomy declines. This trade-off defines the ancient world. Most people do not revolt, they adapt. Revolutions are rare not because people are content, but because systems make resistance costly. Yet tension accumulates. Belief must be maintained, ritual repeated, authority reaffirmed. When belief weakens, power compensates with force. This cycle repeats. By the end of this phase, humanity had mastered large-scale coordination. It had also normalized inequality. The question of who deserves power had not been answered. It had been postponed. And postponed questions return. For most of human history, power did not need to explain itself. It existed. It commanded. It endured. Authority was inherited, enforced, or sanctified. Kings ruled because they always had. Laws existed because they were written. Gods legitimized order because order demanded legitimacy. Most people did not ask why, not because they were incapable of thought, but because the question itself felt dangerous. To question authority is to question meaning, and meaning, once destabilized, threatens everything built upon it. For thousands of years, this risk was avoided instinctively. Yet history shows that questioning is not a moral rebellion, it is a structural outcome. Under certain conditions, doubt becomes unavoidable. Those conditions appear when survival eases, when surplus allows reflection, when cultures interact, and when belief systems collide. When certainty is no longer reinforced by necessity, it weakens. This is when ideas begin to move.
The first sustained challenges to authority did not come from revolutionaries. They came from thinkers. In ancient Greece, the political landscape made this possible. Greece was not a unified empire. It was a collection of small, competitive city-states. No single ruler dominated the region long enough to freeze tradition completely. Power was fragmented, contested, and visible. Fragmentation creates opportunity. In these societies, disagreement was not an anomaly, it was routine. Merchants traveled between cities. Colonies spread across the Mediterranean. Different gods, laws, and customs existed side by side. Nothing felt inevitable. This instability created anxiety. It also created intellectual freedom. Greek thinkers began to notice something unsettling. Different societies believed different things, yet all claimed certainty. If truth were absolute and obvious, why did it vary so widely? This question was dangerous. It implied that tradition might be contingent, not sacred. Philosophy emerged as a response. Early philosophers did not set out to undermine religion or authority. They sought coherence. They looked at nature and noticed regularity. Seasons followed patterns. Objects obeyed principles. The world seemed intelligible without constant divine intervention. If nature could be understood through observation, perhaps society could too. Questions followed. What is justice? What is virtue? What makes a law legitimate? What distinguishes authority from force? These were not abstract puzzles, they were political explosives. To define justice is to expose injustice. To examine virtue is to judge rulers. To question legitimacy is to weaken obedience. Reason entered the conversation, and reason does not respect hierarchy. Reason is impersonal. It does not care who speaks. It can be used by anyone. This makes it subversive. Athens institutionalized this danger. Citizens debated publicly. Decisions were argued rather than decreed. Persuasion replaced command, at least among those included. This was not equality. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded, but the principle mattered. Power now had to justify itself. The sophists recognized this shift. They taught rhetoric, the art of persuasion. They revealed that arguments could be constructed, framed, and manipulated. This disturbed many thinkers. If truth could be persuaded rather than discovered, what protected society from deception? Socrates responded differently. He did not claim knowledge, he exposed ignorance. By asking simple questions, he demonstrated that confidence often masked confusion. Authority feared him not because he opposed the state, but because he revealed its intellectual fragility. His execution revealed a paradox that would echo through history. A society that values inquiry can still fear its consequences. Plato attempted to resolve this by imagining rule by the wise, philosopher kings who understood truth beyond persuasion. Aristotle studied systems, seeking balance between stability and inquiry. Neither solution eliminated the tension. Ideas had escaped control. Elsewhere, different paths emerged. In India, the central problem was not political legitimacy, but suffering. Hierarchies were ancient and rigid. Caste defined destiny. Ritual reinforced inequality. Liberation through social reform seemed impossible. So thinkers turned inward. If suffering could not be escaped socially, perhaps it could be escaped psychologically. What causes suffering? Is desire the root? Can freedom exist within constraint? Buddhism reframed power entirely. No king could grant liberation. No god could erase attachment. Responsibility moved inward. This did not overthrow authority. It bypassed it. A person seeking enlightenment does not fear rulers. Power lost psychological reach. Hindu philosophy explored illusion, impermanence, and continuity. It softened hierarchy without dismantling it. It allowed spiritual movement without political disruption. In China, the concern was order. Constant warfare threatened collapse. Authority needed justification that did not rely on divinity alone. Confucianism moralized hierarchy. Rule became conditional on virtue. The ruler was not divine, but responsible. Legalism emphasized enforcement. Taoism emphasized withdrawal. China blended them. Power stabilized. Questioning remained bounded. Across these cultures, a pattern emerges. Ideas do not always rebel. Often they reinforce. But once thinking becomes systematic, once societies accept that beliefs can be examined, authority can never again rely on tradition alone. Power must explain itself. This is irreversible. Ideas introduce uncertainty. Uncertainty destabilizes belief. Belief, once destabilized, must adapt or harden. The ancient world did both. Empires absorbed philosophy. Law codified it. Belief systems reasserted dominance. But something fundamental had changed. Humans had learned to examine their own structures. Once that capacity exists, it does not vanish. It waits. Once ideas exist, power can no longer rely on silence. It must respond. For much of early civilization, authority was justified by necessity. Cities required coordination. Kings organized labor.
Law prevented chaos. Belief stabilized obedience. These systems did not ask to be admired, they asked to be accepted. But the moment people learn to question, acceptance becomes fragile. This is where empire enters the story. Empires are not simply large states, they're a different kind of political organism. They do not rule one culture, they rule many. They do not depend on shared memory or shared ancestry. They depend on administration. Rome was the first civilization to understand this fully. Rome did not begin as an empire of ideas, it became one out of necessity. As its territory expanded, Rome encountered peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived by different customs. Force could conquer them, it could not govern them indefinitely. Rome needed a principle that could apply everywhere. That principle was law. Roman law did not claim to reveal cosmic truth, it claimed something far more practical: consistency. The same categories, the same procedures, the same logic, applied repeatedly across distance and difference. This was a subtle revolution. Earlier civilizations had used law to formalize hierarchy. Rome used law to universalize order. Citizenship became a legal status rather than an ethnic one. Authority was no longer tied entirely to blood or ritual. It was tied to participation in a system. This made Rome resilient. People did not need to love Rome to function within it. They needed to comply. And compliance became easier when rules felt predictable rather than arbitrary. But predictability is not meaning.
Law can organize behavior. It cannot explain suffering. It cannot answer why one should sacrifice for the whole. It cannot explain death. For that, belief remains essential. Rome's traditional religion had never been deeply personal. It was civic and transactional. Gods were honored to maintain stability. Ritual was obligation, not intimacy. As long as Rome expanded and prosperity flowed, this was enough. But empire creates distance between effort and reward. Soldiers died far from home. Farmers paid taxes to distant capitals. Inequality widened. Life felt less coherent. In moments like this, people do not seek efficiency. They seek reassurance. Belief systems that offered personal meaning began to spread. Mystery cults promised salvation. Eastern philosophies offered spiritual discipline. Identity shifted inward. Christianity emerged from this environment. It did not speak the language of empire, it spoke the language of suffering. It did not promise victory, it promised redemption. It did not require citizenship, it required belief. This was unprecedented. For the first time, a belief system claimed that truth was universal, not because it was enforced, but because it applied to every soul equally. That equality was radical. It undermined social hierarchy psychologically, even when hierarchy remained materially intact. Slaves and emperors stood equal before God. Suffering was reframed as meaningful. Obedience was no longer merely civic, it became moral. Rome recognized the danger. This belief did not call for rebellion, it called for allegiance beyond the state. That made it impossible to fully control. Persecution followed. But persecution misunderstands belief. Violence can suppress behavior, it cannot extinguish meaning. In fact, suffering often intensifies conviction. Martyrdom transformed Christianity from a marginal sect into a moral challenge. Eventually, Rome adapted again. Christianity was legalized, then endorsed, then institutionalized. What could not be destroyed was absorbed. This moment marks one of the most important transformations in human history. Belief and power fused, but in a new configuration. Authority was no longer merely administrative, it was moral. Kings ruled, but under divine judgment. Law existed, but within sacred order. Obedience was framed as virtue. This solved many problems. It unified vast populations under shared moral narratives. It stabilized empire after political collapse. It preserved knowledge. It created continuity where none seemed possible. But it created a new danger. When belief claims absolute truth, disagreement becomes more than dissent. It becomes error, and error becomes sin. This is the birth of absolutism. Absolutism is not tyranny alone, it is certainty enforced at scale. Once truth is absolute, inquiry narrows, interpretation hardens, authority becomes guardian of meaning rather than coordinator of behavior. The medieval world inherited this structure. Faith preserved civilization through chaos. Monasteries copied texts. Institutions maintained order. Learning survived collapse. But inquiry was bounded. Reason could operate, but only within accepted frameworks. Doubt was tolerated cautiously. Heresy was punished not because it threatened armies, but because it threatened coherence. This arrangement worked for centuries because it aligned with lived reality. Most people lived locally. Change was slow. Knowledge was inherited. The world felt stable enough for certainty to remain plausible. But reality does not remain static. Trade expanded, cities grew larger, encounters between cultures increased, knowledge that had been preserved elsewhere returned. The Islamic world, inheriting Greek philosophy, mathematics, and science, did not treat these texts as sacred relics. Scholars debated them, extended them, and applied them. Logic, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics advanced. When this knowledge re-entered Europe, it did not arrive as a challenge to faith, it arrived as competence. It worked. Observations matched predictions, calculations produced results. Nature behaved consistently under scrutiny. This created tension. If the world could be understood through observation and reason, what role did revelation play? At first, reconciliation was attempted. Scholars argued that reason and faith could not contradict each other. If truth was unified, understanding nature honored the divine. This position was careful and fragile, because once reason is allowed to test belief, belief becomes contingent. The door had been opened. Universities emerged as controlled environments for inquiry. Debate was permitted, but boundaries remained. Knowledge expanded cautiously. Meanwhile, lived experience challenged certainty. Plagues devastated populations indiscriminately. Prayers failed. Authority faltered. Corruption within institutions became visible. Disillusionment spread quietly. Doubt rarely begins as rebellion, it begins as disappointment. Artists reflected this shift before philosophers did. Human figures returned to the center of art. Anatomy was studied. Perspective was mastered. The world was observed, not merely symbolized. This was not a rejection of faith, it was a recentering of humanity.
Confidence returned, not as arrogance, but as capability. The Renaissance did not overthrow belief, it loosened its grip. Humans began to trust their senses again. Printing accelerated everything. Ideas escaped institutions, texts circulated widely, interpretation multiplied. Control fractured. The Reformation followed, not because people suddenly desired chaos, but because centralized authority could no longer manage belief at scale. Competing truths emerged. Unity collapsed. Wars followed. This was not enlightenment, it was fragmentation. But fragmentation forced a reckoning. If belief could not unify without violence, perhaps authority required another foundation. Science offered one. Observation replaced revelation as a source of explanation. Hypotheses could be tested, errors corrected. This did not answer questions of meaning, it answered questions of function. The cosmos was no longer centered on humanity. Earth became one body among many. Certainty dissolved further. Power adapted again. Political authority slowly separated from religious authority. States claimed legitimacy through law, consent, or tradition rather than divine mandate. This process was uneven, violent, reversible, but the direction was clear. Ideas were no longer contained. Reason could not be unlearned. Once humans accept that truth can be provisional, that understanding improves through correction, absolute belief loses its monopoly. The modern world did not emerge as a triumph of reason, it emerged as a compromise. Belief persisted, authority remained, but neither could claim total control. This balance is unstable. It demands tolerance for uncertainty. It requires institutions that can fail without collapsing. It depends on citizens who accept responsibility without guarantees. This is difficult, but history suggests it is necessary. By the end of this arc, civilization had learned something essential. Power can be organized, belief can stabilize, ideas can liberate. But none of these alone are sufficient. Each must be constrained by the others. The modern world inherits this unfinished task. It is not the end of history, it is another experiment. One that will succeed or fail, not through certainty, but through adaptation.